Hey guys, it's Ryan. I'm your 2020-2021 treasurer on Vic Exposure, and with the help of David, one of our Co-Darkroom Managers, I'm going to explain to you the basics of using a film camera. Today we'll be looking at how to load and unload a roll of film, the different exposure settings including ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and how to set them properly on your camera. When you want to load a new roll of film, you're going to pop open this knob so that the back pops open, release that, and then you will probably have to pull the knob a little bit more so that it fits in properly. But then you just pop in the roll of film like so. Once your film is in place, you're going to want to pull the film across the back of the camera and place the film inside these little spindles. You want to make sure that your film is located inside the gears and perfectly all the way down, and then you're going to want to twist and release the shutter just a couple of times before to make sure that your film is loaded properly. Then once you've got that just done, you can go ahead and close the back again, make sure that it's properly closed, and then pop down the knob again. Last but not least, you're going to want to move this 1 or 2 times depending on your model, and releasing the shutter till you get to the number 1 on your dial. There are 3 main things that go into setting your exposure for a given roll of film, and those include your film speed or ISO, your aperture or your f-stop, and your shutter speed. Your ISO is a number that comes on your box of film, which indicates how sensitive your film is to light. For example, my most recent roll of film is a 400 ISO film. You want to set your ISO index on your camera to match that on your box. How you do it on mine is you just lift this little dial and turn it to match the window with the same ISO reading that you are having on your film. This way you'll just ensure that all of your other exposure settings are set correctly.
After loading your film into the camera, the first thing you're going to want to do is set your ISO settings on the camera to match those on the film. This you do by finding this dial here, which has the 100 digits on it, and unlocking it. For me is this push button here. It might be different for you. You hold it and just turn the whole dial. If the film is 400 film, you set the dial to 400, like so, and that's that.
Once your ISO is set, you'll determine whether you want to set your aperture or your shutter speed first. You'll set your aperture first if you want to receive a certain effect relating to your depth of field. The aperture is the size of the opening on your lens, which determines how much light your film receives. Aperture is measured in a fraction called f numbers. The higher the number under the f, such as 22 on my lens, indicates a small opening, whereas the smallest number indicates the largest opening, and the interval between these various numbers is called a stop. A large number will give you a great depth of field where you may get most of the image regardless of depth in a relatively even focus, whereas a small number will give you a shallow depth of field, where a close object in the center of the image will be sharp with the background and other objects remaining fuzzy. This is particularly good for portrait photography. You'll want to set your shutter speed first if you want to relate your image to movement. Your shutter speed is the amount of time that the film will be exposed to light, and it's measured in fractions of a second. For example, the number 60 here indicates 1/60 seconds. The larger the number, the shorter the amount of time the film will be exposed to light. On my camera, that is 1000, which means that on this setting, my shutter will be open for 1/1000th of a second. Whereas the smallest number, which on my camera is the number 1, indicates that the shutter will be open for 1 full second. The interval between shutter speeds is also, similarly to aperture, called stops. You'll want to set your shutter speed relating to how fast you want to capture certain objects. A high shutter speed, such as 1000, can freeze fast action like running water down a river or a car on this road. A low shutter speed, such as a half or 1 full second, is better for a low light setting when you want to create more of immersion blur or there is little to no movement in the setting.
Once you've set your ISO and are familiar with how to use the light meter in your camera or an external one, you're going to want to set your exposure settings on the camera. You can do this A with your shutter speed and B with the aperturing. To set your shutter speed, you just turn this dial Really simple. If you want a shutter speed of 30, you set it to 30, etc. With aperturing, every old style lens has this, so you gotta make sure you're using a film camera lens. And if you want an aperture of 1.4, for example, you just line it with that little dot or line in the middle and set it to whatever you like. If I want 16, I turn it all the way around to 16. Depending on your camera model, you may also have automatic functionality. My camera in this case has auto aperture priority and auto shutter speed priority. To use these functions, I set this little dial here to A for aperture priority, and then set my shutter speed to 125, the highlighted value. This lets the camera control my shutter speed based on my aperture. So I can set it to 8, for example, and my camera will automatically pick the shutter speed that's best for the exposure. Then if I want to use shutter speed priority, I set it to the S and move my aperturing to 16, which is also the highlighted value. This lets the camera this time control the aperture, and I can pick whichever shutter speed I'd like. For actually winding your film and taking the shot, the process is really simple. You use this toggle, pull it all the way across until it clicks. Make sure it can't go any farther. Let go, it'll still be in this open position. Make sure it stays that way. You have your shutter speed set, your aperture set. You just click the button, take your shot, and you're done. If you want to go again, repeat, click. Once you're finished, make sure you close that knob. It locks your shutter. Another useful tool your camera might have is a built-in light meter. This tool basically tells you how to properly set up the shutter speed and exposure for your shot. I turn it on now by just holding down my shutter button halfway. You can see a little red light come on. Right now it's set to 1000, telling me that my shutter speed needs to be set to 1000. As I move around away from the light, you see it go down to about 30 or 15, also telling me that my shutter speed has to be set to 30 or 15. And as I move around, it just goes up and down depending on the light. It's important to note that your camera might not look the same way. It might just be an arrow telling you to go up in shutter speed or down in shutter speed, or it might be a little line that indicates the number instead of a light. Another important thing to note is that depending on your camera model, you may also have to open this toggle here that actually turns on the light meter. To expand on setting up your exposure, if I want to shoot with an aperture of, let's say, 5.6 in this case, I can use my built-in light meter to measure the proper light settings. If I hold down my shutter button halfway, right now it's telling me that I need a shutter speed of 60. I can then set my shutter speed to 60. I can wind my film and take the shot.
Once you have set both your ISO and either of your aperture or your shutter speed, you'll want to go and look inside your viewfinder to set the last setting. In my camera, you can see that there's a little light meter on the right-hand corner. The little matchstick is the light sensitivity, and you want to move your aperture or your shutter speed to match the center of the matchstick. You can see that mine is already perfectly lined up, so what I would do now is roll the film and take a photo. Once you're ready to unload your film, you're going to want to press your rewind button at the bottom of the camera and make sure you've actually pushed it in all the way. Then you're going to flip up the little flap and twist until it gets taut. Once it's gotten taut and then released again so that it's moving pretty freely, you want to just flip that back in and then release the knob. And right inside, you should have your completely, perfectly unloaded roll of film. You now know the very basics of working with film photography. And even though your camera may look very different to our two models that we use today, these basics will help you regardless of whatever kind of camera you're working with. Keep in mind that the more comfortable you grow with the basic rules, the more you can begin to defy the rules and play with your photography to create desired and unique effects in your own style. I hope you found this video informative and feel more comfortable with film photography, and we look forward to seeing your work soon.